Hello, I'm John Vervaeke, and I'd like to talk to you today about what I think the role of religion and spirituality is for us today and going forward. And in order to make this statement, I want to first develop a set of important ideas. First of all, I want to try and get at what I think one of the central roles or functions of religion is, and why that's perennially important. And so I want to talk about sort of perennial problems that religious ways of life address. And then I want to turn over to, well, what are the pressing issues facing us right now? And what might that mean for how religion and spirituality are going to configure themselves or need to configure themselves going forward? So the core idea I want to start with is this idea that's at the core of my scientific work. I'm a cognitive scientist. Is an idea I've developed called relevance realization. This is the idea that the core of your intelligence is a dynamic self-organizing process by which you're able to zero in on relevant information. Out of all the information that's available to you in the environment, you can zero in on the relevant information. Out of all of the information available in your long-term memory, you can zero in on the relevant information, possible combinations of it. Out of all the possible ways you could combine your behavior to generate a sequence of actions to address your problems and achieve your goals, you zero in on the relevant information for that. And you're doing all of this in a massively interconnected and constantly evolving dynamic way. And the way you experience this experientially, a lot of this processing is happening, of course, unconsciously, but what it does is it gives rise within your consciousness to a salience landscape in which things are standing out, being foregrounded, things are being backgrounded. It's constantly textured and flowing. It's both being altered by your attention, but also capturing your attention in a self-organizing manner. And then the idea is that this salience landscape sort of constitutes what I call your perspectival knowing what it's like to be here now, to have a sense of presence, a sense of connectedness to the world. It's ultimately grounded in your participatory knowing. Your participatory knowing is the way in which, first of all, evolution, through something like a niche construction, has co-shaped environment and organisms so that that mutual shaping, so they fit together, so that affordances open up for them. Their biology and the environment fit together. So, such that, this ground for me is walkable because of the way my biology has evolved, the way the ground is oriented. And then, of course, culture mutually shapes me and my environment to great affordances. We make tools. Here's a glass, right? I shape the environment, right? But I also can shape my actions so that this becomes graspable to me. So the participatory knowing is generating all these affordances. And then my perspectival knowing is drawing them up into a ongoing flowing salience landscaping. And within that, I am trying to connect. I'm trying to deeply connect to my body. My body is not a thing I have. It is a way of being for me. And so I'm trying to be as deeply connected to myself. I'm trying to enhance my connectedness to the world, the environment. And I'm also trying to enhance my connectedness to other people because I'm a sociocultural being. And all of these, of course, are higher order versions of that very relevance realization process. So I'm trying to really connect what's relevant about my body right now, and what's the relevant relationship between mind and body, what's relevant between the dynamic self-organizing processes of my embodied brain and the dynamically unfolding environment. What's relevant between me? How are people relevant to me? And very importantly, because I'm cultural, how am I relevant to them? How do I matter to them? And what this brings up is beyond salience, this brings up meaning, not the sense of semantic meaning, although that's not irrelevant. What I want to focus in on here is a sense of meaning in life, the sense that your life is somehow worth living in some primordial and persistent fashion. And what the research seems to show is that sense of meaning in life is about being able to access, activate, and accentuate these kinds of connections, the connectedness to myself, so I have a sense of competence and autonomy, my connectedness to my environment, so that I am capable of, solving many of my problems in a comprehensive, coherent, and organized way. So the world I get insight into the intelligibility of the world. I feel in touch with reality. So think about two important sort of overarching meta drives you have. One is to have an inner kind of harmony. We talk about this with a kind of peace of mind. I'm not at war with myself. This is flowing fluidly and fluently, and that I'm in touch with what's real, And so we want those two things. But we also, and this is very important, we need to matter to other people. That's an aspect of being in touch with what's real. But again, it's not just being causally effective on other people, it's contributing to their relevance realization, being relevant to them, mattering to them, making a difference to them, independent of my own egocentric projects and goals. So we have these perennial goals of trying to enhance and celebrate that relevance realization machinery in these experiences of connectedness. So I use the word religio for that, which might be one of the contenders for the etymological origin of the word religion, because it means it means to bind together. So one of the things religion has done is it's bound us, right? It's given us a sense of binding to ourselves, to the world, satisfying that need for a kind of inner harmony, a connectedness, being in touch with what's real, and a mattering to other people. That's what I mean by religio. And so religions have created sets of practices. Each individual practice has a strength, associated strengths and weaknesses, and it's created sets of practices which are also self-organizing. So I refer to those sets of practices as an ecology of practices, the way within an ecology of organisms that have sort of checks and balance or relationships to each other, and an overall self-organizing system that's designed to sort of I don't mean anthropomorphically, but it self-organizes such to maintain a dynamic fittedness to its environment. And so one of the things that religions are doing then, if you allow me, is they're homing us. Because think of what that experience of being at home is like. So when you're at home, you feel mostly you feel most at peace with yourself. You feel most, at one with yourself. You are really well fitted to the environment. You've shaped the environment and you've shaped yourself to that environment. So you're really in touch with that. It seems very real to you. And home is the place where you're with the people that matter the most to you and to whom you most matter. And of course, home isn't just your dwelling. You can be at home in your country. You can be at home in your religion. You can be at home in your worldview. And that's what I would want to argue that religions did, that they created ecologies of practices that gave people a worldview that made them feel at home, that made them feel that they were connected to themselves, connected to the world, and connected to each other. So connected to themselves, this is the idea that human beings have a capacity for growth and development, and those developmental needs to become are very important to us, because that's a way in which we are improving that fundamental connectedness to ourselves. So there's an order in which we're constantly trying to self-transcend, the normative order, be better, meet that need, constantly activate and accentuate that need of being fundamentally connected to ourselves and optimizing the internal relationship, reducing the internal conflict, affording a coherent interaction with the world. We, of course, want to matter to others, and so we sort of have this narrative structure. There's a story that we're telling, and that story should matter to other people and should include and involve other people. And as I said, we also need to feel like we're in touch with the world, that there's a nomological order, an overarching way in which the world makes sense to us, such that we fit into that sense that is made, and it connects us deeply to reality. So religions have created ecologies of practices for enhancing religio by creating various transformations in how we're connected to ourselves, the world, each other, and situating that within a worldview that gives us a sense of, a normative order on how we can develop, a narrative order on how we can matter and be involved and care with other people, and also a nomological order, which, how things fundamentally deeply make sense in terms of how we fundamentally and deeply are making sense. So our attempts to make sense and how the world discloses itself as intelligible are bound together. So that fundamental relationship that I talked about in participatory knowing, in which we and the environment are mutually shaped so that affordances open up, and then salience landscapes open up, and ultimately the connections of meaning making and open up for us. That's one of the main functions of religion. This facilitation of the flourishing of religio. There's another important and perennial function, and this has to do with the fact that the very processes, those dynamically, massively complex, recursively self-organizing processes that couple our sensory motor loop to the world and make us ongoing, adaptive, relevant, realizing, intelligent agents, those very processes that make us very powerful, intelligent problem solvers also make us subject to self-deception. That's because, as I mentioned to you, they work in terms of making things relevant and salient. One of the problems with that is often what can happen for us is the wrong features of the world are made salient or important. The wrong things are foregrounded or backgrounded, etc. And therefore we misframe reality in a fundamental way, and we deceive ourselves. And so I've extended the Frankfurt's notion of bullshitting as something distinct from lying. Bullshitting is not when somebody is manipulating you because they're telling you something that's false. Bullshitting is when somebody's making you indifferent to whether or not it's true or whether you understand it. What instead they're doing is making something very salient to you, because salience is a way of connecting you to something and thereby manipulating you. So one of my standard examples is in advertising. You'll often work to make products salient in a way that doesn't necessarily make any sort of deep believable claims about them. So you see the alcohol commercial, somebody's drinking the alcohol, well, actually not drinking, about to drink the alcohol, and there's all these beautiful, attractive people, and they're all healthy looking, and they're all beautiful. And that's all pretty much false. That's not the typical pathway associated with alcohol consumption. And so it's not true, but the commercial's designed to sort of make that make you indifferent to whether or not it's true. What happens is the product is made salient to you, and therefore you buy the product. So we because of the kind of creatures we are not only vulnerable to lying, we're vulnerable to bullshitting. And here's the important point. We can bullshit ourselves. We can, because our adaptive intelligence is constantly doing this flowing salience landscape, it can often misfit us to the world, give us a maladaptive way of what we're finding salient and relevant, and we fall into self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. So what religions have helped to do is also address that issue. They have created ecologies of practices that have been designed, to address the perennial problem of foolishness, because that's what I'm going to call these self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns. And so they have given us ways of trying to improve our curation of our attention, right? How we pay attention so that we can reduce self-deception. They have given us ways of modifying and transforming how we aspire, how we try to connect to the world, how we connect to ourselves. So I won't go into detail in this, but the point I'm trying to make is that many cultures, in many historical contexts, this is a universal thing, address these perennial problems of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior by creating ecologies of practices that are supposed to help ameliorate those proclivities And this is what has been called, this is at least one aspect of wisdom. Wisdom is the ability, right, to systematically and reliably, not perfectly, not completely, not finally, that's not going to be possible for us, but systematically and reliably ameliorate foolishness. But we can put the two together now. What is wisdom about? Wisdom is about an ecology of practices that can ameliorate foolishness and afford the flourishing of religio in an integrated and mutually supporting fashion. And then that, of course, as I said, has to be situated within a worldview that does two things. One I already mentioned, it has to home us. It has to give us this sense of being well connected to ourselves, to the world, to each other. But it also has to constantly provoke the evolution of religio, the evolution of that relevance realization ability, the evolution and development and improvement of our capacity to be fitted to the world. And therefore, religions also have to expose us to what Otto called the numinous. They have to expose us to things that will shake up our worldview, shake up our sense of connection to ourselves, to the world, to each other, open us up in wonder and awe so that there is the possibility of dynamic restructuring of that worldview, and it can evolve its capacity to ameliorate foolishness and afford flourishing. So what religions are, I think, are complex ecologies of practices that are doing this dynamic attuning of our worldview. There's an aspect that's trying to home us. There's an aspect that's trying to expose us to the numinous. And it's doing all of that because what it's trying to do is get a worldview that is constantly evolving and in service of the two functions of ameliorating foolishness and affording flourishing. So that's why I think there is a perennial aspect to religion. Now, what are the pressing issues? Well, I think the pressing issues for us on one hand are what Thomas Bjorkman calls the meta-crisis, the fact that we're facing imminent ecological disaster, increasing socioeconomic disparity, political disenfranchisement, and political ossification, and those two are interlocking together. There's going to be issues surrounding energy again soon. So we're facing all of this, and they're pretty significant threats, and yet we seem incapable individually and collectively of addressing that. And I think that has to do with a problem that is seriously impairing our comprehensive problem-solving abilities. And I call that the meaning crisis. And what do I mean by the meaning crisis? What I mean by the meaning crisis is that we've gone through a set of historical developments that have undermined our wisdom institutions, undermined our wisdom traditions, undermined our wisdom practices, and that have even more significantly, although all of these things are interrelated, undermined the worldview that legitimated those ecologies of practices. So most of our world religions and wisdom traditions were born in the Axel Revolution, in which what emerged was what I call the two worlds mythos, the idea that there is the everyday world, and this is the world that is beset by self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And then there's the real world that we can get to by some form of self-transcendence, that is a world as it is truly seen. And in that world, we have sort of the maximal reduction of our foolishness and the maximal affordance of our flourishing. We are deeply connected to ourselves. We are deeply connected to each other and to the world. And it's both a home for us, right? In that that is where we deeply and truly belong and are fitted. But it is also constantly opening us up and awe and wonder, right? And so you get all these metaphors of enlightenment and heaven and the promised land. There's of course lots of cultural historical variation on this grammar, but it's also a very shared thing. And the basic idea here is that legitimates all of those orders are talked about. It gives you a way of making sense of your sense making. It tells you what's real and what's not. It makes sense of your desire for self-transcendence, to go up the normative order, to become better. Because what is that? Well, that's moving up. It's transcendent. It's going from the illusory, fallen, or decadent world to the true, final home world of some kind. It gives you an overarching narrative of how what your story is, what other people's story is, how they fit together. So you had this amazing mythos that did all of these functions that I mentioned, deeply allowed us to access and accentuate and even celebrate religio, cultivate wisdom, ameliorate foolishness. But that worldview, that two-world view, for a whole host of historical reasons, has been largely disappearing. We are getting a flattened single worldview, the scientific worldview. And what that means for us is that a lot of the language and imagery that was made sense of our ecology of practices, legitimated it, told us how we could find a nomological order, a narrative order, a normative order. All of that has become non-viable for an increasingly large number of people. So more and more people find the established world religions non-viable. Let's be very careful what this means. It doesn't mean that they've sort of just come to reject the claims as false. That's an inadequate analysis. So the sort of new atheist movement, I think, misframed fundamentally what was going on here. They thought the issue was, well, you just need to sort of speed up the process of getting people to disbelieve in the world religions. I think that's a very problematic thing to have concluded, because many of these people that are abandoning religion are abandoning it more because of its non-viability to them. It doesn't give them a worldview that they can inhabit that will actually give them those fundamental connections, give them religio, give them the orders. But that doesn't mean that these people become just sort of atheists in a standard meaning of the term. Many of them pursue spirituality. They pursue individually, often in a fragmented and dangerously autodidactic fashion. They cobble together ecologies of practices, because you cannot avoid the problems of foolishness. You cannot forestall forever your hunger for flourishing. And so they cobble together different kinds of solutions. Some of these solutions, of course, can be very maladaptive and very and harmful to individuals and communities. And so work I've done with Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Misevic, especially the more recent work I've been doing with Christopher on symptoms of the meaning crisis, you can see people, the rise of not overall in the world, because in the world overall suicide is going down, but amongst certain groups, the affluent and especially the next generation, right, and children, suicide is rising. You see increasing loneliness. There's major surveys in the UK saying that most people, I think like 89% of people, think their lives are meaningless. You have the fact that we seem to be getting increasing cycles of addiction. And you need to think of addiction not along the medical model of a disease, but I think Mark Lewis is ultimately right, that addiction is, think about what we talked about, of this sense of connectedness, right? What Mark Lewis argues is that addiction is a reciprocal narrowing. Like I drink the alcohol and I lose some of my problem-solving abilities and my world starts to shrink a bit. I lose some of the options, and then I internalize that. And then my cognitive flexibility shrinks a bit, right? And then that right, makes my world shrink more. And then you see what happens. It reciprocally narrows until the world can't be any other than it is. and I can't be any other than I am. And so now I'm compelled and I'm locked and I'm trapped. And you see this kind of reciprocal narrowing. And the reciprocal narrowing is, this is what I mean by a form of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior that's taking place at that perspectival and that participatory level. So the mutual shaping between the agent and the arena is going fundamentally awry, and they're collapsing. And they're collapsing because there isn't a worldview and an ecology of practices and wisdom institutions and wisdom traditions that tell them how to do the opposite, how to do reciprocal opening and fall in love again with the depths of being. So you see the addiction crisis, you see the escape, right? The virtual exodus, as it's been called, that people are spending more and more time within virtual worlds and video games. Why? Because the video games have the features that are lacking in the real world. In the video game, there is a clear narrative, there is a clear story, and you play a fundamental role and you matter. There are rules, there's a clear nomological order, there's rules that make sense of everything, and your project of problem solving always fits with that world. And there's a way, there's a normative order, there's a way for you to develop and self-transcend. You can level up and you can get into the flow state, that wonderful state of dynamic coupledness and at one-ment. And so people are preferring the virtual world, and that, of course, ultimately has deleterious effects. The World Health Organization is now has that now officially designated something, video game addiction. You can see, of course, all of the attempts that people have to make certain particular meaning systems do the work of an entire worldview. You have various political ideologies, or you have the idea that, and Thomas Bjorkman makes a great argument for this in his recent book, that because we've undermined all these things, we've sort of left by default the market in charge as our God and our religion. And that, of course, has some very pernicious consequences for people psychologically and existentially. But you see positive responses too. You see people trying to bring back the wisdom traditions, like in this the Stoicism movement. You can see the mindfulness revolution. Now, there's problems, there's criticisms of that. There's ways in which it's being trivialized and made superficial and being commodified. But there's also an impulse in there to overcome self-deception in a comprehensive and existential manner. You see people trying to renew a capacity for symbolic developmental play in many instances. So all of these things are happening, and more importantly, you see, and I get to work with these people, you see emerging communities, people putting real time, talent, money, and effort into building ecologies of practices within communities, and then starting to try and network these communities together, and online forums, like, for example, Rebel Wisdom, that are trying to get these communities to talk to each other and give them an overarching shared language, shared conceptual vocabulary, shared theoretical grammar, so that they can facilitate the emergence of a new culture, a culture that awakens to religio. So all of this points to that we're in a meaning crisis, that our capacity for accessing, activating, and accelerating and accentuating religio is seriously truncated and defective in our culture. We're suffering, and I hope this now makes sense to you, in a very serious wisdom famine, and which is precisely the worst time for this to be happening, because we have too much information, and we have too much knowledge, and we have too much of that knowledge wrapped around us in technology. Now, what that means is we're suffering a meaning scarcity, and when people are in a scarcity mentality, they lose their cognitive flexibility, they lose their ability for insight, for self-transformation, for radical self-transcendence, because they're trying to secure and hold on to what they have less. So we're in this meaning wisdom famine, which means we are losing the capacities for insight and self-transcendence and aspirational development that we need in order to address the meta crisis. People will make titanic sacrifices to their standard of living and their subjective well-being if they are confident that what they are involved in, it will give them more religio and put them on the path towards wisdom, the way I've talked about it here. But if people do not see such a pathway, if they do not find anything viable, if they feel that their religio is constantly under threat, then they, of course, will hang on to what little they have that is somehow, in a way that they cannot completely well understand, bound up with the fragments and filaments of meaning that remain for them. They will try to gather together as best they can the tattered shards of religio. But if we could give people a reliable and systematic ecology of practice that would afford the amelioration of foolishness and afford flourishing, then people would be able to address individually and collectively the pressing problems of the meta-crisis. So I think one of the things that religion has to do is to make central addressing the meaning crisis so that we can address the meta-crisis. Now, there's a problem that we have to face with this, because given what I said about the non-viability of many of the traditional religions, there's a sense in which we cannot, for many people, we can't go back. There are, of course, many powerful movements of nostalgia on right now. Just if we could just go back, you know, fundamentalisms and literalisms and nostalgias, right? But that's ultimately not going to work. The attempt to deny and avoid the scientific worldview, I think, is an attempt that is doomed to failure. It's quixotic, precisely because you don't think of science as just a set of propositions that are being collected in journals. Science is a fundamental way in which we are trying to overcome self-deception and get knowledge of the world that expresses itself in pervasive patterns of conception, pervasive patterns of problem solving, pervasive solutions to problems that are wrapped around us in technology. We are swimming immersed and we deeply internalize the scientific worldview, claiming, for example, that you don't believe like in something like the theory of evolution, and then going to your medical doctor who is making use of the science of biology that is grounded in the theory of evolution in order to treat you. That's a fundamental kind of cognitive dissonance that ultimately can't be avoided. I do not think that nostalgia is a solution. I think a utopic vision that claims to have a perfect account of what the future looks like, and so that we can get to some complete and final state, I think that's the vestiges of that axial age grammar that we need to let go of. We need to stop thinking about a promised land, a completeness. We have to move towards a new conception of the sacred, that the sacred has these two poles to it, that reality is actually inexhaustibly rich, that our relevance realization capacities can never drink it dry. It always exceeds and transcends them. It's a perpetual fount of new intelligibility, new connectedness. And our relevance realization machinery is not a fixed ideology. It is an open-ended, evolving process that can constantly readapt and evolve itself to tap into that inexhaustibility. And when we do that, we most deeply access and accentuate and can even celebrate our religio. So I'm proposing that we need a sense of sacredness that is neither nostalgic nor utopic, and that we need an ecology of practices that cultivates that sense of sacredness, that experience of sacredness and its transformative potential, in a way that is consonant with our inevitable and pervasive scientific worldview. So I talk about this as the religion that's not a religion. It's a religion in that it can't be an ideology. It cannot just be a set of of propositions dealing with your propositional beliefs. It has to reach down into your procedural knowing, your skills. It has to reach into your perspectival knowing, your salience landscape, and your sense of being connected here and now present. It has to reach down into your participatory knowing, that way in which you are homed and exposed to the numinous and generates all these affordances for you. Think about what happens when you go to another culture that you've never been before. You experience a kind of culture shock because that participatory knowing isn't properly there, because you haven't participated in the way you and the environment have been co-shaped by culture. Or when you're far from your home and you experience homesickness, or you're away from the people, you know, those people that you're shaping there and they're shaping you. When the sites of participatory knowing are undermined, you experience, right, culture shock, you experience loneliness, you experience homesickness. But if you're experiencing that within your culture, that's the meaning crisis. And so we have to learn how to alleviate all of that sort of culture shock, loneliness, homesickness, that's pervading our lives in a way, but we have to do it in the place where we are, in our historical context, in a scientific worldview. So we need to reconfigure I would argue, our sense of sacred. We need to make that, right, the focal point of our ecology of practices, this activation and accentuation and acceleration and appreciation of religio in a way that is deeply consonant with our historical situation and the profundity of the pervasiveness of the scientific worldview. And we need to do that in a way that is well engineered. We need to rescue and recover what was best from our religious traditions, treat them with respect, right, like we would our parents. And we need to be willing to re-engineer. It's already happening. New ecologies of practices, new communities, new senses of what it is to experience the sacred and to pursue self-transcendence. We need to try and bring all this together in a project that will give us what religion used to. That's how it's a religion, but it's a religion that's not a religion precisely because we have to give up, I argue, that axial age cognitive cultural grammar that makes us either nostalgic or utopic as we try to get to the upper world, the perfect world, the future world, etc. Instead, right, we need something that's not just an ideology. It is a carefully curated ecology of practices centered on affording sacredness that then allows people to engage in fundamental, it allows them, affords them, liberates them to undergo the significant transformations of cognition, consciousness, character, communitas, culture that are going to be needed to address the meeting crisis. The only thing that has done that for us in the past is religion. We need something like religion, but it can't make use of the axial age mythological cultural cognitive grammar. It has to be engineered collectively and individually to address the pressing issues of the meaning crisis and the meta crisis right now. And so I argue that what we fundamentally need is this religion that's not a religion, that gives us a way in which we can recapture the cultivation of wisdom, the experience of sacredness, and affords us dealing with the deep challenges of the meta crisis. Thank you very much for your time and attention.